Good morning from New York. I'm Chris Hayes. As part of his trip through Asia this morning, President Obama is right now holding a news conference in Bangkok, Thailand. He just spoke about the crisis in Gaza, where Israeli strikes overnight reportedly hit 2 buildings in Gaza City, housing several media outlets. We'll have more on that, including President Obama's remarks, later in the show. But first, my story of the week, the real scandal of the Petraeus affair. All right, here's the background context to the seemingly unending string of revelations about General Petraeus' extramarital affair that I, and I'm not going to front, have been following with a mix of fascination and shame for the last week and a half. Over the last 2 decades, or the last decade, 2 trends have conspired to vastly reduce our privacy. First, there's technology. Social media has allowed us to share every last detail of our lives, often intentionally and often unintentionally. The photo accidentally tagged on Facebook, the wayward strike of the reply all button that shares your thoughts about a friend's disastrous significant other. You get the picture. We now leave a digital trail traceable by anyone with the resources to buy access to it. Just this week, we learned the Obama campaign knew what TV shows some of its targeted voters had watched. And then there is the massive explosion of the surveillance state in the wake of 9/11. Thanks to the Patriot Act, its reauthorization, the FISA reauthorization, and a series of policies and precedents during the Bush administration that had been continued and codified under the Obama administration, the government has access to more info about us than at any time in history. As just a small example of what this looks like in practice, check out this graph of U.S. government requests for information from Google. These are requests that don't require warrants. And most crucially, this doesn't include the secret national security-related requests, which are not disclosed. For a while, I thought the combination of these 2 trends, the ubiquity of technology and the growth of the surveillance state, were pushing us towards a very dystopic future, one in which citizens would be unable to keep any of their secrets, while the government would be able to keep all of its secrets. I feared we'll eventually end up totally exposed, both to each other and to the state, while the state and its doing, and what it's doing in our name, will be shrouded entirely in mystery. And then, somewhat miraculously, but also when you think about it inevitably, these 2 trends collided with each other in the Petraeus affair. The 4-star general's private communications with his biographer, Patricia Broadwell, and a widening group of ancillary characters reveal a whole lot of mundane personal failings, hurtful and shameful, sure, but really, it seems, not anything actually scandalous as far as the public sphere goes. In fact, the only real possible public scandal here, as far as I can tell, is the conditions under which the FBI came to read the private emails of Petraeus and Broadwell. We now know the investigation began because Jill Kelly, an acquaintance of Petraeus who served as, let me make sure I get this right, the unpaid social liaison at MacDill Air Force Base in Tampa, received some hostile anonymous emails that chastised her for allegedly flirting with Petraeus. Kelly then complained to an FBI agent named Frederick Humphreys, and somehow, against the odds, an FBI investigation into cyberstalking was opened, one that led the FBI to read Broadwell's emails, then Petraeus's, and now here we are. Cyberstalking investigations appear to be rare. In fact, thousands of women in this country are cyberstalked every year, and the recourse for them is often nothing, which itself is a problem. Just 10 cases have been prosecuted under federal cyber harassment law over the past 2 years. And yet somehow, in this case, it seems that because Jill Kelly knew a guy, an investigation got opened here. If the thing that decides whether a case is opened is that someone's got an agent's business card, then we're in trouble. But in the midst of all this breathless coverage, it has been difficult to separate the substantive from trivial, the prurient from the relevant. And that's because as gripping as the tale is as human drama, it is almost entirely that. A human drama. People acting as people do. I'm reasonably sure that a sweep of any cluster of citizens' emails opened at random would reveal similarly sordid travails. That's the point. We all have facts about ourselves we don't want the world to know. And that's precisely why privacy is so important, why control over the intimate details of our lives matters, particularly as a core protection from state overreach. The power that comes with inside knowledge of a person's secrets and intimate details of their private life has been, throughout history, an accomplice to tyranny. Even if the days of J. Edgar Hoover are long gone, we should remember his ghost still hovers over all of us. Right now, I'm joined by Spencer Ackerman, senior reporter for Wired's national security blog, The Danger Room, and Tara McKelvey, a correspondent for Newsweek and The Daily Beast, and a fellow at Harvard's Shorenstein Center for the Press, Politics, and Public Policy. David Frum, author of the new ebook, Why Romney Lost and What the GOP Can Do About It, which is a hilarious title because it makes me think you started working on it 5 years ago. And Julian Sanchez, a research fellow at the Cato Institute and contributing editor at Reason Magazine. It's great to have you guys all here. Julian, you've been doing fantastic reporting for a long time about the national security state and technology. What do you make of this? And tell me a little bit about what are the conditions under which the government can read my email? Like, I think the first thought a lot of us had when we saw this was, what exactly does the FBI have to do to get into your email account?
Yeah, it's actually kind of shocking. As a result of a series of weird Supreme Court decisions from the late 70s, the government actually doesn't have to meet that highest standard. There's a 1986 law called the Electronic Communications Privacy Act that governs federal access to electronic communications. And while it requires a warrant for access to essentially unopened emails, it permits a subpoena or a court order based just on a weak showing of relevance to be used to access emails that have been opened, documents that are stored in the cloud, and also emails that have sat on a server unopened for more than 6 months. In this case, it does look like a warrant was used to get at Broadwell's emails. Since she's a sensitive investigative subject, actually, it seems like probably the Attorney General should have had to personally sign off on that. I'm curious whether that was done in this case. But they don't have the kinds of added protections that would apply if this were a wiretap of her phone line. So, for example, if it were a phone wiretap, they would have had to show that there wasn't a less intrusive way to conduct the investigation. They would have had to implement minimization procedures, meaning, the kind of thing where they hang up the phone if it's a mobster's wife calling her doctor as opposed to the actual target.
Right.
And when you think about the vast amount of email archives that are stored in a cloud service like Gmail, it really is a little bit weird that we don't apply this, because every sort of constitutional reason that you would want those added protections for this kind, because it's secret, because of the incredible volume of innocent information that's exposed, would seem to apply to email, but they don't.
I'm still stunned by the fact, just this basic fact, which I've learned in reading about this and prepping for today's show, which is that that 1986 act, the Electronic Private Communications Act,
Electronic Communications Privacy Act.
Right, ECPA, right. That emails over 6 months, basically the government can just go to the email provider and be like, hey, can you give me their emails? And they can say, sure.
Yep.
And I mean, everyone just think about emails that are sitting on their server older than 6 months as basically having a big, sign on your house in terms of the amount of privacy that they confer.
That's right. Yeah. In the Sixth Circuit, there's a case called Warshak where a court did actually say that even for those older emails, the Fourth Amendment applies there. It's amazing to me that it took as long as it did for a court to rule that the Fourth Amendment is applicable to email and other kinds of digital communications like that. But so you have it. And there are providers like Google that actually have been pretty aggressive about pushing back.
Right.
And they are able, because they've got a solid legal team, to insist on a warrant. It's not clear why a warrant would have been granted in this case once they had identified the person who sent the emails, but again, there you have it.
This is a legacy of the days before email was stored, correct?
Right. Yeah. The logic behind the 1986 law is, right, this is written again back at a time when
most people are downloading email onto their actual computer, which then becomes the physical thing that you would have to search.
Right, and the theory was right. Email is going to be protected once you've downloaded it on your own computer by the Fourth Amendment, and so they can assume that no one's, of course, going to store all these emails out in the cloud, because a megabyte of storage space in 1986 costs $100.
You guys both of you are national security reporters, and you report on intelligence and stuff. And one of the things I think that's been interesting in the post 9/11 era is that we've seen this growth of the surveillance state, and there's been amazing reporting on this, and there's been very little political pushback. I mean, it just doesn't seem like. I mean, obviously the ACLU and CCR and a lot of groups do really remarkable work in pushing against this, but in terms of a constituency for privacy, it's been a little hard to locate that. And I wonder if you guys think why that is, and if something like this changes that dynamic.
I mean, I think people are more upset about the violations of privacy than they are about a lot of the policies of the government. So I do think that's something that people get worked up about, the fact that someone can read your emails, though mine are perfectly readable and very boring. Totally have access to them.
I think there's a constituency that you can see pretty much across the political spectrum that is searching for a champion.
Right.
And there was a bit of a projection in that community, and 2008 that it might be Barack Obama, the former constitutional law professor who had talked in the days when he was, coming to the Senate about the excesses of the Bush-era warrantless surveillance programs, who then, when he sees he has a reasonable chance of becoming president, and there's an important Senate fight over authorizing those, somewhat legally grandfathering them back in and making them retroactively legal,
right,
he immediately jumps to the side of enormous expanded executive power. And we haven't seen... there have been some people, Rand Paul is a good example, Ron Wyden is another good example, Jason Chaffetz in the House, of people who are recognizing that there's across the spectrum a tremendous fear about how much information the government can simply very easily and, apparently legally see. Yeah. Waiting to see someone make that a real issue, and the irony might be you get the David Petraeus Electronic Records Privacy Act of 2013.
That's the interesting thing, and particularly for conservatives, I'm curious where the right is on this, because it seems like it would be possible to build some constituency there. David, I want to hear your thoughts on that after we take this quick break. David, it's been interesting to watch conservatives respond to the Petraeus news, because I think he's thought of very well among conservatives, particularly because of his role in counterinsurgency and the surge in Iraq. But then he's also working for Barack Obama, and then there's this scandal around him. And I wonder, do you think there is a constituency on the right for an actual privacy interest?
Well, I'm one of the less libertarian conservatives you're going to talk to. And to my mind, the really startling thing about this case is that there hasn't been enough secrecy. I think it's completely understandable that the FBI would want to know that if someone has classified documents who's also had an intimate relationship with the CIA director, you'd want to know about that. You may have a leak here. That's something to be investigated. Once you've investigated it, once you've discovered it was a purely personal matter, the question is, why did it make it into the newspapers at all? And you can imagine in a different time and place the way this story would have been handled would have been the FBI would have concluded its investigation with discretion, would have shared what it knew with the president.
And then J. Edgar Hoover would have just let you know that he knows this about you next time that you guys were fighting some bureaucratic battle.
I'm right now reading Gene Edward Smith's biography of Dwight Eisenhower. Everybody knew about Eisenhower's affair. Right. Eisenhower at one point talked about maybe divorcing his wife, and he was told by the Chief of Staff of the Army, if you do that, right, you will be fired. But if you don't divorce your wife, we will all keep this entirely quiet. The president couldn't refuse David Petraeus' resignation. When you said at the beginning of the segment, you said a very interesting thing, that we face an invasion of privacy from technology and from the surveillance state. It seems to me it's like saying New Yorkers were threatened by a giant tsunami and then by the risk of great white sharks. That one is so colossal, so gigantic a fact. And we think of every...
You're talking about technology being the big one.
Every terrible, humiliating invasion of privacy story you've heard. Remember that poor woman who wrote an intimate love letter to the man she'd met, and he then forwarded it to 87 of his friends? Yep. Like, that had nothing to do with the state. That is, I mean, I don't know where she lives now, probably New Zealand. That all of these, and in the lives of the younger people we know, the children, none of the things that ruin their lives have anything to do with government. It all has to do with technological possibility.
Well, then what do you say to General John Allen, right? Because at a certain point in this investigative history, Allen's emails that seem to be somewhat, just friendly to flirtatious, from what we know from the woman who starts this investigation, gets swept up in this pile. And for reasons that are really not clear to myself and some other reporters, they get sent to the Pentagon for an Inspector General investigation, because conceivably these flirtatious emails might indicate an adulterous affair, which is illegal under the Uniform Code of Military Justice.
If that had happened,
that's a government
and we'd never read about it. If we'd never read about it, there would have been no problem. The reason that this has been so catastrophic for General Allen is because it was leaked. This is a story about leakage of investigation.
Bizarre.
No, but
it's not a bizarre.
This was not initially an investigation into the leaking of classified documents. Right. To be more justifiable, this was an investigation into half a dozen snarky emails. And also, I mean, the comparison here is odd. I am a libertarian, but I think you're being too individualist about this, right? The problem in the 60s and 70s, when the FBI was spying on the sexual activities of Martin Luther King and other civil rights activists, anti-war activists, members of the Supreme Court, members of executive agencies, was not just that it was individually embarrassing for them and a violation of their personal dignity. It's that politically, in a democracy, secrecy, the kind of power that comes with that information is dangerous beyond whatever indignity is visited upon the individual.
But we are going to keep a very close eye on the private activities of the head director of the CIA. This is somebody who's got all kinds of valuable information. There have been security problems at the CIA in the past. That is something that counter-espionage is a fact of life. But it doesn't have to appear in the newspaper.
General Petraeus actually his email from the CIA, I would be a lot less disturbed by this.
General Petraeus actually had this sort of amazing thing that he said in March when he was talking about the new era of tech. He said, I'd like to briefly discuss 3 major challenges of this new era: the utter transparency of the digital world. We have to rethink our notions of identity and secrecy.
None of us, and certainly nobody in politics, is more than 10 seconds away from a career-ending moment. I mean, Mitt Romney, think of the 2 biggest stories of the Mitt Romney campaign for the presidency are all the gifts comment, the 47%, all produced because somebody had a smartphone in his vicinity. And that will happen again and again to people in politics. But that's got nothing to do with the state.
Tara, yeah.
I'm wondering what your career-ending moment might be.
I would love to hear.
It's a delicious
buffet.
Just here.
Yeah, I won't tell anybody. But just reminded me of what you were saying about the investigation. Yesterday I was talking to somebody from Joint Special Operations Command, and he was saying the problem was with the FBI that they investigated. And as soon as they saw the emails, and what they said about Paula, they should have dropped the whole thing. But I personally think they should have doubled down and done a full court press on this. There should be a special heartbreak division at the FBI investigating these crimes, and then I think things would be better here.
You do think that?
Yeah, sure.
But here's the other question. I think now when we say, well, there's some private misdeeds, and I don't want to minimize this. I mean, I think anyone who's been in a relationship understands the betrayal here from a personal level, right? So I'm not trying to minimize it, but the question is as a matter of substance and policy. Then the question is, should what we've learned about General Petraeus cause us to rethink the Petraeus legacy and his relationship with the press?
We should summon him back to duty.
What's that?
We should summon. We can't. We have so few good generals. The president should have refused his resignation. The president now. I don't think a general can retire. You remain on active duty. He's a 4-star.
Spencer wrote a big mea culpa about his contribution to the, quote, cult of Petraeus. Tom Ricks just wrote a big book, A History of Generals in the Post-War. We're going to talk to both of them about the legacy of General Petraeus right after this. All right. The revelations about General Petraeus have occasioned, I think, some rethinking of the general's legacy, and also, I think, more specifically than the legacy, his relationship to the press. And I think what is open for debate, and as someone who's not a national security reporter but reads some of your fine reporting on this topic, is this question of, should this make me think that the Petraeus myth was hype from the beginning, or should this be irrelevant? So what? So the guy had an affair. Now, it happened. The reason that I think heightens attention here is the affair was with a woman writing an incredibly adulatory biography of him. I want to bring in Tom Ricks, author of the new book, The Generals, American Military Command from World War II to Today, also a senior fellow at the Center for New American Security, Pulitzer Prize-winning former reporter at both the Wall Street Journal and the Washington Post, and now writing the best defense blog at foreignpolicy.com. Tom, I'll start with you. Do you think this should occasion us to take a hard look at the coverage of General Petraeus over the last, say, 8 years?
There's no question that General Petraeus recognized that he needed to talk to the media. I think what worries me here is the lessons that other generals will draw, which is, hey, you're too smart like David Petraeus, you engage the media, and you end up getting in trouble. I think that's exactly the wrong lesson. Petraeus understood that one of the roles of a general is to be a megaphone, to explain his policies, to reach out to his soldiers, to the American people, and in Iraq, to the Iraqi people, and get his views out there. So I think he was very good at it. Unusually for an Army general, he has a PhD from Princeton. He likes reporters and politicians, and he had a successful first tour in Iraq. In the Army, that's 3 strikes. I'm going to tell you, though, you're talking about the FBI scandal. I think there's 2 scandals in the Petraeus affair. One is indeed the invasion of privacy, the FBI looking into lovers' quarrels. The other scandal, and I think it's even more worrisome, is that nobody pays attention to these wars until there's some sort of titillating affair.
Yeah.
It makes me think that we as a people care more about the sex lives of our generals than the real lives of our soldiers. The scandal to me is we tolerated 3 years of lousy generalship in Iraq.
Yeah.
Tommy Franks, Ricardo Sanchez, and George Casey before Petraeus actually quite improved it. The scandal is 11 commanders in 11 years in Afghanistan. That's no way to run anything.
Right, and there was this amazingly brutal, darkly hilarious Onion headline about Americans horrified to learn details of Afghanistan while searching for sex details about Petraeus scandal.
Yeah, we found out there's a war going on.
Spencer, I want you to respond to Tom here because you wrote this piece that I thought was a really, really honest, great piece of introspection about how you contributed to the cult of David Petraeus and what this is occasion for you to think about the relationship between the press and Petraeus specifically and generals in the military more broadly.
Yeah, it seemed to me while I was covering the Broadwell affair, it was hard to understand the affair and how it could have started without understanding the cult of personality that existed around Petraeus. There's a reason why he's having an affair with a biographer. There's a reason why there's purchase for a lot of biographies about
There's
Petraeus.
like 4 biographies, I think, been published on Petraeus?
Something like 4.5, depending on how we count some of Tom's books. And it seemed to me that if this was also a media story, it would be kind of dishonest not to look a bit at my own role in here. And you know, I want to take a little bit of an issue with something Tom said. You know, Petraeus likes journalists and so forth, and that goes to him. I think Petraeus had a mission to pull off, as he defined it, which is getting information out to the public that was favorable about the war itself and how he prosecutes it, and to a lesser but included degree about himself.
Right.
And so that's what I wanted to look at. It happened to be the case, as I think Tom experienced as well, that a lot of Petraeus's peers did not want to have the kind of back and forths that Petraeus made himself available for, and that became an occasion for, and I'll take responsibility for this, myself, viewing perhaps Petraeus as really being a more intellectually honest steward of this war, and that influenced my coverage somewhat. So I wanted to account for that.
Well, and Tom, also, I mean, one of the things I think that's come out here is, you hear now in the aftermath of this about, a lot of his peers really didn't like him and resented him and were frustrated and thought he was essentially a con artist, etc. And I don't necessarily say, well, clearly they're right, and Petraeus is, was a terrible kind of con artist, and he pulled one over on the press and the American people. But I guess I feel like I would have liked to have known that back during the period when all coverage of General Petraeus was essentially uniformly positive than now in the aftermath.
Well, you should have read my book.
Yeah, you are. No, I did, and you are an exception to that.
I wrote about criticism of Petraeus in my book, but look, I still think he stands out as an exceptionally good general, especially in comparison to his peer group. We have a lot of mediocre generals in the Army. We have a very few really effective ones. The lesson here in the Army is go ahead and be mediocre as long as you keep your pants on.
Right.
This is a terrible outcome in which public performance, execution of one's duties gets a free pass, as long as you don't embarrass the institution. It's like being a university professor having tenure. You can do a lousy job as long as you don't go and boff the undergrads.
And that's a bad precedent.
I wish we were focusing much more on how good generals are than what they do at home at night.
One of the legacies also of General Petraeus in his brief term at the CIA is the ways in which, both as in terms of counterinsurgency, in terms of the war in Afghanistan, and his tenure at the CIA, is the emergence of a kind of ongoing perpetual secret war the U.S. is waging through JSOC and special forces and a militarized CIA. Tara, this is something you've covered. I want to hear your thoughts on that right after this break. Tara McKelvey, I want to read you a headline from the Washington Post, October 18th. CIA lobbying to expand its drone fleet. Headline, CIA seeks to expand drone fleet. Officials say the proposal by CIA Director David H. Petraeus would bolster the agency's ability to sustain its campaigns of lethal strikes in Pakistan and Yemen and enable it, if directed, to shift aircraft to emerging al-Qaeda threats in North Africa or other trouble spots. The CIA is shifting in quite a remarkable way, and I think that's undercovered. How important do you think this move into a kind of paramilitary organization is for the agency and for its future?
I mean, it's extremely important, and Petraeus' affair for all of the privacy issues certainly makes people talk now about the war in Afghanistan and also what's happening with the CIA. But it didn't start with Petraeus. The paramilitarization of the CIA started, a lot of years ago. The 9/11 Commission report came out in 2004 and said that the CIA needed to get its act together and needed to conduct paramilitary operations in a way it hadn't done before, and they started ramping it up at that point.
And there's a lot, yeah, please.
Yeah, the history of the agencies involved in these things tends to be pinballing between these extremes, between collecting and analyzing intelligence and conducting operations. It seems like you're always asking the CIA to do several impossible things. One is these kind of zipless coup or otherwise untraceable operations that maximally impact American foreign policy without American fingerprints, or you're asking them to predict the future. And neither of which, this expectation is, for either that states out is healthy for the conduct of the intelligence activities that U.S. foreign policy actually needs.
But it also seems, I want to show this because this is very interesting. There was a lot of concern when Michael Hayden was nominated to run the CIA about the fact that the CIA should be essentially a civilian agency. Not essentially, it is a civilian agency, and the militarization of it and it being essentially folded underneath the Pentagon's orbit. Here's just some both Republicans and Democrats expressing their concern about this back during the Bush administration when Hayden was first nominated.
There's a power struggle going on between the Department of Defense and the entire rest of the intelligence community. So I don't see how you have a four-star general heading up the CIA.
We should not have a military person leading a civilian agency at this time.
You can't have the military, I think, control most of the major aspects of intelligence.
The fact that he is a part of the military today would be the major problem.
Tom, that one of the concerns there, right, is that the CIA would be this independent check on Pentagon intelligence and overreach, and I wonder where that objection went.
Well, I actually think it's a bit overstated. The first director of the CIA, if I recall correctly, was a general himself. There's always been a close cooperation in a lot of ways. I actually think the real tension seems to be between FBI and CIA. But, there's also a direct connection between what Tara is saying about drone warfare and the Petraeus affair. And they both go to the issue of American inattention to a great democracy waging war, killing people overseas, and nobody here paying attention. 1% of the nation fights, 99% of the nation does not pay attention. And I think that's morally reckless for this country.
Yeah, and I think one of the really problematic worries about the secret wars we are increasingly conducted via robot is that only accelerates that tendency, right? Because now, if we can conduct these wars in secret and there's not even human beings whose boots are on the ground, right? Not even our fellow citizens who are waging the war, that even gives us one more reason, essentially, to withdraw our public attention.
Prediction, we're going to have...
It's fire and forget warfare with a Congress that doesn't want to question this, doesn't know how to question, a media that doesn't really understand the military or espionage much anymore, and an American public that would just as soon not pay attention because they're sick of these wars. I think it's a very potent mix that could bite us on the ass in the end.
And we're going to have a lot more of it in the next 3 years for three reasons. Pressures on the defense budget will make the president rely more on these lighter, cheaper agencies. The frustrations of the second term, at least after the first 3 months, drive presidents to be more activist in foreign policy. And finally, the legacy of Benghazi, the 4 Americans killed, that is now a major controversy, will continue to be one. And the lesson the president will draw from that is you can get a lot of robots killed and have no congressional investigations.
Right. And a lot, this has to be said, and a lot of Pakistani civilians. That
really leads to no investigations.
No, I know that, but that's to me, that's the big moral problem.
One of the things that tends to get swept up in these discussions is that the lesson of the past 11 years of war is that we don't know how to win wars.
Right.
We've lost the sense of only waging wars that we can actually triumph in. The mark of the past, I suppose, 11 years of war for success is that we keep fighting them.
Right.
That becomes the measure of success. And when we're fighting wars in secret, with nearly no disclosure about their operations, there's not going to be any available metrics for what success in those things are. So that's another reason that the spread of these wars into the shadows is a problematic enterprise.
This is not a new thing. This is what
it doesn't matter if it's a new
this happened
thing.
between 1947 and 19...
series of
right, and
it's decelerated compared to the scale of the secret wars between 47 and 89. What has been happening since 2001.
Right, but of course, there was a national reckoning. The Church Committee moment, particularly, in which we recognized that there was a tremendous amount of horrible things done, a lot of overreach, a lot of strategic disasters for America committed in secret during the long secret wars of the Cold War, and that's something that a lesson I don't think we've quite learned.
You need periodic reckonings, but you also need not to give up because that secret war ended in a spectacular
We're
success.
overdue for a reckoning. Tom Ricks, author of The Generals, thanks for joining us this morning. Spencer Ackerman of Wired's national security blog, The Danger Room, Tara McKelvey of Harvard Shorenstein Center, and Julian Sanchez of the Cato Institute. You at home should be reading all of them. Great reporters. Thanks so much.
Thanks, Chris.
Thank you.
The latest on the fighting in Gaza, how it started, and what happens next when we come back. The bloody conflict between Israeli forces and Palestinian militants intensified this morning, with Israel expanding its bombing campaign to government and media buildings in Gaza, and Palestinian militants firing rockets towards Jerusalem and Tel Aviv, where Israel's Iron Dome missile defense system intercepted at least one incoming rocket this morning. At a press conference in Thailand just this past hour, President Obama asserted Israel's right to defend itself.
Let's understand what the precipitating event here was that's causing the current crisis. And that was an ever-escalating number of missiles that were landing not just in Israeli territory, but in areas that are populated. And there's no country on earth that would tolerate missiles raining down on its citizens from outside its borders. So we are fully supportive of Israel's right to defend itself from missiles landing on people's homes and workplaces and potentially killing civilians. And we will continue to support Israel's right to defend itself. Now, what is also true is that we are actively working with all the parties in the region to see if we can end those missiles being fired without further escalation.
With troops amassed along the Israel-Gaza border for potential ground invasion, Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu said this morning that the Israeli military is prepared to, quote, significantly expand the operation. The back and forth has been escalating since at least Wednesday, when Israeli forces killed Hamas military chief Ahmed al-Jabari in a pinpoint aerial bombing. Since then, Israel has carried out a series of coordinated airstrikes on targets in Gaza. Palestinian officials told Reuters the Palestinian death toll is now at 56. Hamas has retaliated with a barrage of rocket fire, killing 3 civilians in a small town in southern Israel on Thursday. Netanyahu said on Thursday that Israel will not tolerate the continued rocket fire.
No government would tolerate a situation where nearly a fifth of its people live under a constant barrage of rockets and missile fire. And Israel will not tolerate this situation. Israel will continue to take whatever action is necessary to defend our people.
In response, Hamas Prime Minister Ismail Haniyeh said, quote, the time in which the Israeli occupation does whatever it wants in Gaza is gone. Haniyeh's compound was later targeted by an Israeli airstrike. He was not there at the time. So what ignited this most recent round of fighting? Israeli officials point to ramped up rocket fire from Gaza in recent months, which they say demands a military response. According to the Israeli Defense Forces, the IDF, Palestinian militants had fired more missiles and rockets into Israel through October of this year than in all of 2011. But there is also undeniably an asymmetry in the death toll the violence has taken, even before this latest conflict. From the end of the last major round of fighting between Israeli forces and Palestinian militants in 2009 through September of this year, 25 Israelis had been killed by Palestinians, while 314 Palestinians had been killed by the IDF, according to the Israeli human rights organization B'Tselem. One of those Palestinian casualties, a 13-year-old boy, was killed by Israeli forces in a gunfight with Gaza militants on November 8th, according to the Jerusalem Post. Many point to that as a major escalating incident that precipitated this most recent round of intense fighting. As for how and when the hostilities will end, Israeli Defense Minister Ehud Barak said Thursday that's unclear. We cannot predict exactly what the endpoint is, Barak said. At the moment, there's no reason to stop. Joining me now at the table are Noam Shazaf, an Israeli journalist and editor of Plus 972 magazine and a former IDF officer, Noura Erakat, adjunct professor at Georgetown University and legal advocacy coordinator at Badil Resource Center for Palestinian Refugee and Residency Rights, and Youssef Munir, executive director of the Jerusalem Fund, which presents a Palestinian perspective on the Middle East peace process. It's wonderful to have you all here. I wish it were under better conditions. I begin, as Americans watching this, the conflict seems impenetrable and interminable and constant. So then every once in a while, rockets start flying or there's a bombing strike. And I think Americans look and they go, well, what happened? Why now? Noam, I guess I'll start with you from the Israeli perspective. What is your understanding of why this is happening now and what internal political dynamics in Israel are leading to whatever strategic decisions are being made in sort of how to pursue this?
So there is, of course, the issue of the rockets that has been escalating in the months leading to this assault on Gaza. There's also been some number of border incidents. Israel's control of the border around the Gaza Strip, and it defined an area of about 17% of the Strip as a no man's land that nobody can approach. And around this area, sort of security zone, if you want, there have been a number of incidents in which several Palestinians were killed, several soldiers were injured, and that contributed to the escalation. But what's important, I think, is from the perspective of the Israeli leadership, there is also a political window of opportunity here. We're heading to an elections in Israel. The public demands a more proactive approach to the conflict. And I think the government, in ways, is responding to that as well.
And there's polling out showing widespread, massive Israeli public opinion support for this, for the Gaza actions as of now. We'll see if there's a ground invasion if that were to continue. Nora and Youssef, I wonder from the perspective of internal politics in Gaza, I guess what are the politics driving the increase in rocket fire as the first question, and what are the politics driving the response now in the midst of this?
Well, look, first of all, there's a number of different factions in Gaza, including Hamas, but also a variety of other factions. The Israelis, through the Egyptians, have been working with Hamas to crack down on the rocket fire, and that has worked largely thanks to one of the point people there, Ahmed Jabari, who they just assassinated. Right. And obviously that created a significant problem. One Israeli journalist put it that Israel had eliminated its subcontractor in Gaza. The Palestinian factions object to extrajudicial assassination and are willing to not respond to what's going on in Gaza as long as these assassinations don't continue. As long as they've continued, we've seen increases in rocket fire. The bottom line is there is no military solution to this issue. You simply cannot bomb people into liking you. It's not going to work. And so,
yeah.
Well, I just wanted to add to that. We're discussing, what precipitated this. President Obama is trying to pinpoint the exact date, and that seems to be the debate in our mainstream media cycle. But if all rocket fire were to stop today, right, and all aerial missile strikes and ground offensives from Israel were to stop, the violence against Palestinians would continue unabated in the form of occupation, a naval siege, arbitrary detention. And so when we ask what started this, we're not ever getting to the root of the conflict.
Let's talk about the context of Gaza and the blockade and what that's meant.
Well, let's talk about this. It's a little thick to hear it said that Hamas objects to assassination when its stock and trade is mass murder.
Let me also say that we'll get back to that. The other factions you're referring to, just so people know, it's Islamic Jihad, the Popular Resistance Committee, and those have been some of the people firing the rockets, even if Hamas was essentially in this weird backdoor way tasked with enforcing this hudna, this ceasefire. More on this right after this break. You said you referred to extrajudicial killing in reference to the killing of Ahmed Jabari, who Israel said was a terrorist, was the mastermind of the kidnapping of Israeli soldier Gilad Shalit, which of course was a huge issue. Just to get a sense, I think, of Israeli public opinion on this, as we understand what the politics are internally, this is the opposition leader, Shaul Mufaz, on targeted killing as a policy. He says, I'm in favor of targeted killings. It is a policy that led Hamas to understand during the suicide bombings they would pay a price should the bombings continue. And this is, the IDF put up this, on their Twitter account, this graphic of Ahmed al-Jabari sort of celebrating his demise, with the word eliminated, planned multiple terrorist attacks that killed Israeli civilians, commanded the operation to kidnap Gilad Shalit. This is, I think, a popular policy in Israel, and it's seen as essentially a targeted way of dealing with the term that's been used. I think the perspective about Hamas and Gaza is mowing the lawn, right? That if you essentially let them to fester, then they plot and they plot, and the rockets go up, and then every 4 years, because we had cast lead 4 years ago, you have to go in and do something.
Well, it's popular and it's maybe effective in the short term, but what I'm concerned about is the fact that there's no long-term policy from the side of the Israeli government. Basically, the only thing that the government is offering the public is those targeted killings. Had there been a vision of a diplomatic solution with the Palestinians, we might have probably seen some support to it as well. And you mentioned former Defense Minister Shaul Mofaz. Shaul Mofaz, as the leader of the opposition, called for direct negotiation with Hamas on some sort of a diplomatic settlement in around the Gaza Strip, but the government so far is limiting its tools to military assassinations, to military assaults. So it pretty much makes it clear that this escalation will only lead up to further escalations in the future.
One part of the context that needs to be also stressed is that Hamas had been building a much more sophisticated rocket force over the past year. And that was the specter, or the force behind the curtain that was, I think, maybe the driving of the timing of this attack, that they were going to get a lot better rockets, and they were arriving rapidly, and they've been destroyed in these operations. And the second thing that needs to be said about the diplomatic vision, of course it's right. I mean, you want to look for a long-term diplomatic solution. But peace, you can't, because peace cannot be made with Hamas, and you've probably had talks with people there, and you speak to them, it's not possible. The vision always has required the Palestinian Authority to exert power over Gaza, and including potentially violent. But how?
They lost a coup, and they had their leadership killed by Hamas.
And they won't. I mean, no one. That has been who is the Michael Collins of the Palestinians? Michael Collins being the Irish leader who went to war with his own IRA to say we will accept a finite peace. And in the absence of that,
we're not giving airtime to.
Yeah, a couple points here. First of all, in terms of mowing the lawn, I absolutely abhor that idiom that the Israelis use. It's extremely callous. We're talking about a population of 1.7 million people, 80% of whom are refugees, 80% of whom rely daily on handouts just for daily sustenance.
And half of them are under the
children.
age of 18.
You cannot. Noam's right. There's no long-term strategic thinking on the part of the Israelis. If you sow seeds of hate, mowing the lawn is just not going to work.
More on this after a break.